Hi, my name is Chris Ayers, and today I want to talk to you about .NET Aspire and aspiring with Azure OpenAI. My name is Chris Ayers. I'm a senior risk SRE in Azure CXP, our customer experience program, and I really focus on Azure reliability. You can reach out to me at lots of different places, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. I've got a blog, and all of my code is out on GitHub under the username CodeBytes, including this talk and all these samples. So I just want to quickly go over Aspire, like why .NET Aspire, their integrations, how to use it, and then I want to really dive into like how we can integrate it with AI in our solutions and how we can actually run it locally as well as in the cloud. So .NET Aspire is designed to improve the experience of building cloud-native apps, which I love, and it has a couple of different pillars around orchestration, integrations, and tooling. It can help build and deploy resources into Azure and other clouds through like automated management. It can start services, stop services. If we add containers, it can add those. We have a centralized place to manage our config. So I don't really need to worry about a lot of things. I can have it wire them up through passing environment variables or key vault or other parameters. It's awesome. Aspire components add integrated logging and monitoring. So we have support for open telemetry, which I love. And then it makes it really simple for me to just hit F5 with the app host project. So instead of having to start 4 or 5 different containers and get connection endpoints and IP addresses or ports, I can just start one thing and it'll handle all of that for me. And I'll talk about that. Now, integrations are where Aspire gets all of its power. You get integrations into Azure as well as local emulators, through other containers, you get authorization, but there's also this community toolkit, which adds all of these other capabilities, like Ollama, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about in case you want to work on AI solutions and you're not connected to the cloud. And it makes integrations really simple. There are amazing tooling support through Visual Studio. Inside the code, it makes it work really well. There's project templates. And I'll show you the dashboard as well as some of the host and service defaults. There's been a lot of information about .NET Aspire, so I don't want to harp on that forever. But when you use .NET Aspire, the integrations come in 2 parts. There's the hosting side, where like we have the app host project and we can set up our integrations, we can set up the dependencies, and then we have our client side where we can consume those various integrations. And that could be in our .NET code, that could be in Python, that could be in Node. That's different containers and executables. It really helps manage all of that and drive that configuration through environment variables. Another cool thing we get is service discovery. So we don't have to worry about a lot of IP addresses. We can just worry about calling our service, how we want to call our service. And I'm going to show you a lot of this stuff, as well as some of the really cool things we can do with allocating new resources in the cloud with Azure. I don't have a Node or Python project, but there is great support for launching Node and Node front ends, doing Python. If you want to do some Python backends, there's a lot of cool samples around that. Now today I'm going to talk about using the Azure OpenAI and Ollama integrations. I might add in Redis as well, but we can leverage all sorts of different high-level integrations that are first-party, third-party. It's fully open source. You can go and add your own. I actually have a talk I'm planning on giving around making your own Aspire integrations. And then when we consume those, we want to have the things that are baked into Aspire, what we call service defaults. And that gives you discovery by name, so we don't have to worry about IPs and ports. It gives us the standard way we want to access services. So if we have retry policies, if we want to have rate limiting, if we want to support our local F5 debugging and launch profiles and use those so that we can have that consistent feel. If we want to have health checks and telemetry baked in on every call and dependency, all of that is awesome and integrated in. When I keep talking about service discovery, like a lot of this is done through environment variables, which might be passed between one project to another through connection strings or environment variables. Maybe it's an endpoint with an IP. So we'll use those environment variables and configuration to pass those dependencies between things. And Aspire's been growing. Like now we have ways to issue commands in our local development environment where we're restarting services or caching container volumes, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. And as I said, because there's some really cool stuff going on with service discovery, you can see at the bottom, like these environment variables get set as we start using and consuming resources between different services. And I'll show you how you can find that as well, just as we go through the samples. And there's a lot of open source projects that are out there, but not all of them have the same level of authentication or secret management. Not all of them have retry policies or circuit breaking. Not all of them have monitoring and observability baked in. And so by having an Aspire integration, that standard that is there for Aspire gets wrapped and baked into each of these. So there's an Aspire integration, like I said, for Redis or for Olama that adds in these type of service defaults and capabilities so that we have kind of consistency across all of our integrations that go from our development up into production. And let's talk about some of the cool capabilities with Azure. So I use Azure OpenAI a lot. And so if I'm using, for instance, Visual Studio or the CLI, I might want to have Aspire create those resources for me so I can consume them, so I can quickly iterate and build faster and faster. Now, there are a lot of cool credential stores baked into how Aspire works. Now, it'll use my default Azure credential pretty much everywhere it can, and it can pull that from, like, if I've logged into the CLI or PowerShell, if I'm using Visual Studio, which I'll show, or Visual Studio Code, I can set which profile I want to use to create resources in Azure. And then I can deploy those by just hitting F5. And now once I've deployed, I can do some really cool things with Aspire using the CLI, the developer CLI that can actually set up pipelines for me in repos so that it can know about running the project, know about provisioning, and handle all that for me. And I'm not going to dive too much into that today, but let's get into some of the code. Now, all of these slides are available out of my repo, Code Bytes built with Aspire. The slides are right there. So I've got the sample project. And I'm going to start with the app host because I've done some interesting things here. So the app host project is where you define all of your different components and wire them together, setting up dependencies. And I've done a couple of interesting things with this sample because I want to be able to work locally on my machine. I do have a GPU. So if I bring up my taskbar and I look at my performance, I have an NVIDIA GPU and I have, multiple cores on my CPU. So there is a great tool out there called Olama that a lot of people leverage. You can use Olama, you can tell it to leverage your GPUs, you can give it a model like 3.2, and I'm actually going to use a config value. I'm going to use an app settings here to say, hey, I want to use my local AI and I want to call it chat. And so, maybe I define an AI, an OpenAI instance and a deployment out in Azure. Maybe I just want to start out with Olama and build from there. If I'm using my local one, I want to use Olama and I want to pass that into my code. So I can hit F5 or run, and I can start my application. I did a thing, so let me just fix that real quick because I was being fancy. So we'll start our application, and one of the great things you get with Aspire is you get this dashboard. So you can see it's starting a container for Olama. It's already pulled down and is running Llama 3.2. Now it does say it's trying to allocate an Azure OpenAI, and it's giving me some information that I'm missing, subscription information. And so this is one of the newer things they did with Aspire 9. We've got actions over here. So we got some, and you can actually customize and add to these. But if I look at my logs, this is just giving me some information that I don't have provisioning information for Azure, which is completely okay. I've got a front end that depends on my back end. And if I look at my front end and I come over here to details, I can look through and I can see the endpoints for this front end, and I can see some configuration information for the back end, like OpenTelemetry. So I've got logging, and I've also got these two environment variables here, which are going to be passed in. If I look at it, it's going to show me the endpoint for my local API service. And if I look at my local API service real quick here, I've got logs. And if I go into the details for it and come down here, I can see those environment variables I passed in, where I have an AI of Olama, and I've got a connection string to my chat object, and there's my endpoint to my local Olama that's running. But let's go ahead and launch this and just take a look real quick. I've got a weather component, and for each weather that runs, what happens is it will try to generate a summary to describe the temperature. I've also got a basic chat client here, and I can just come and say hi and say, speed of light. And if I look at my GPU, I can see that it's spiking. If I tell it something like, tell me a long story, and I look at my code, I can see my GPU spikes and my CPU isn't. So I'm running this locally on my GPU, and it's generated a long story for me. So I'm doing AI with a local Olama. And let's go take a look at that. So here's my front end, and in my front end I've got I'm adding service defaults, and I've set up two HTTP clients, one for the weather, using this interesting syntax here, HTTPS, HTTP API service. So that API service is the same name that I had in my app host right here, API service. And I set that with a reference in my front end API service. So that's where the connection string is going to get passed in, and I told it to wait for API to start. Now API has chat. So if we go and look at API service, here things get a little bit more interesting. I'm pulling some values, and these are actually coming from environment variables. These are passed in from the app host. And if I'm doing Olama, I'm adding an Olama client. And if I'm doing OpenAI, I'm adding an OpenAI client. But then after that, I really don't care. My code is using a chat client. I'm able to get weather summaries. I'm able to make a conversation and send it off for completion against an AI model locally or in Azure. And this is possible through some of the new Microsoft Extensions AI that's come out in the past couple of months. It's really cool stuff. And so I'm running Olama locally. Now let's change this around a little bit. Let me go back to my app host. And let me tell it I don't want to use a local model. I want to use an Azure model. So what I've said here is I want to use OpenAI, and I want to make an OpenAI deployment. I want to do 4.0 GPT 4.0 with the latest model version global standard. So on this time, let me just stop this and let's restart it, and let's see a couple things that happen here. So this is going to start up, and we've got our portal. And what I ignored before, which I want to resolve, is how I can start doing development in Azure locally. And it is, hey, look, it's trying to provision this, but it's saying it can't be because they don't have a subscription, a location, or resource group information. And I can go out here to Aspire Azure local provisioning and see what it's talking about. This actually gives me all the information I need around what I need to do. So I can load information potentially from a key vault or from a connection string if it's something that exists out there. But if I'm iterating very quickly and I want to get started and build stuff, I can go out to my app settings and I can add in my subscription ID and allow resource group creation and location. I can do that, or I can, like I said, pull from some of the different stores. So one way you can do this is you can add it to your, let me stop this. You can add it to your user secrets. So I can come here and I can add it here. But I don't want to do that by hand. What I can also do is I can right click on connected services and go Azure Resource Provisioning Settings. So I can come here and pick my subscription. I can pick a location like Sweden Central. I could pick a resource group. I already have one there. I can say OK. Now if I, because I know it's there, if I come and check, it's already added those details into my user secrets. So if I try starting it again, since I've given it the provisioning secrets, I've given it all the information it needs about subscriptions and resource groups and location, I can watch these logs and I can see, look, it is telling me I could probably upgrade my bicep because it's using my local AC bicep, but it's starting a deployment. I can actually go out to the Azure portal and watch a deployment as it takes place. Well, it didn't let me into the portal. I'll show you something in a second why. But let's just keep watching. It's waiting for the deployment. Notice it hasn't started the API service and it hasn't started the front end because I told it to wait for those resources to be created. And the reason I think I saw an error in going to the portal there is you can come down here to Tools Options in Visual Studio and you can look for Azure and you can actually select which account and tenant. So if you have multiple Azure accounts or multiple user accounts and you want to go to the portal. So this finished, and if I look at this, I can see that the deployment took 41 seconds. And once that finished, the API service started, and we could say waiting for it to get into running. It finished. So now I've got all my services green, and I can go back to my front end, and I can try the weather service. Now this time, if I look at my GPU, it's not spiking crazy or doing anything interesting, but it's still running fine. And I can use my chat messages and I can ask it questions and get responses back from Azure OpenAI. So these, I quickly switched from using an on-prem, on my device AI model to using one up in Azure with just a couple of quick switches. Now, let me go ahead and stop the code. Let's go poke around this a little bit. Like I said, part of what I'm using is some of the newer Azure AI extensions. Just loading config from your app host configuration. That's just basic .NET. Like we can just access values from our configuration. Now, when we make a resource like an Azure OpenAI resource, we're going to get like a resource builder type of resource. We could add an additional deployment if I wanted to add a deployment for a different type of model, like embed. I could pass that in there with a model name. So if I wanted to do like Ada, I could pass that in there with the version. So we have the model name or the deployment name, the model name, the version, and then the deployment type. So, and how many tokens per minute you want to allocate it to. For Olama, I didn't want to have to download. So Olama runs as a container, and I didn't want to have to download Llama every single time because when you download Llama, that takes up some storage. So I gave it a data volume, something persistent, so that it would only download it one time and I could keep running it over and over again. And I did a little bit of fun stuff to pass a single type of resource to the backend. But let's dive into the backend a little bit more. So one of the cool things that this new extensions AI adds for Olama and Olama Sharp is it registers it as a chat client. So I had to manually register the Azure OpenAI one because I still need to work through the code a little bit, but Olama registers itself automatically. And that means I don't have to have in my code, do I depend on Azure? Do I depend on Olama? Do I depend on OpenAI directly? I just call it a chat client, and I don't have to really care too much about the implementation because I've set that up in my program above. And so I can just call a chat completion and not worry about it. Now, I also had a chat service. So I was using semantic kernel. And again, there's some tweaks I need to do with the code. This right here is a evaluation thing, but I can just take a chat client like the one I have registered for Olama or Azure OpenAI, and I can use it as a chat completion for semantic kernel. And so I can call semantic kernel and pass in messages and get a chat completion and have that code operation just like I did before. I don't really care if it's an Olama or an Azure OpenAI. Now, what if we want to keep building and adding more resources? Maybe I want to start using Redis. So I want a Redis. I can just add, well, a couple of things. First, I would need to, let's go manage our NuGet packages for the solution. I'm going to look for aspire.hosting. And in aspire.hosting, there's our Redis. So this is the one that we're going to add to our app host so that we can create and maintain our Redis instances. That's going to go into my app host. And I will apply that. And then, yep, I know it doesn't contain the definition. Thank you. The other thing I want to do is I want to look for Aspire Redis. And so this is the client side. So I want to install the client side into my API. So I'm going to install that there. Apply. So now we got the dependencies. Let's go fix the code. So we've got the add Redis, and then on my backend down here, I can, with reference Redis, one I can tell it to wait for Redis, and then I can go into my code. I can add a Redis client, Redis. Now, if we start up the solution again, and we take a look at what happens, because I haven't given it any information about Redis, what it's going to do is, and you can actually see it right here, it's going to start a Redis Docker image. And if I go and check my API service now, and I look at my details, there's now a connection string here for Redis. So, and this connection string is matching the Redis connection string. So in 3 or 4 lines of code, I've added a dependency on Redis, and it's set up the container, and it's spun it up, and I can see the Docker pull, and I can see it running. So I don't even have to think about a whole bunch of configuration or all the steps. I can quickly get up to speed and build on my application. So I can even restart Redis or dive in. And there's a whole bunch of really amazing features in this dashboard if you haven't used it before. So if I come here to the weather again, where I'm calling out to Azure OpenAI, or I come here and tell me a story. If I go back to my dashboard, once the story finishes, I can see what's called structured logs. They're also over here. And you can see there's some traces. So if I look at my trace, I can get all of the span and trace information from the various calls and how long they took. And I can go look at some of the details on those individual calls. Like, this is OpenTelemetry baked in end to end. Like, it's really powerful and really cool. And if you haven't started using this for local debugging, troubleshooting, I highly recommend it. And then as I dive into my application, if I need to look at statistics around my requests or connections, or I need to dive into exceptions or garbage collection, like, all of the metrics that .NET spits out are just incredible. There's so many metrics that you can dive into. And so this is a centralized place for all of my application troubleshooting. So as I'm building .NET applications, as I'm building OpenAI applications, uh, I live in this tight inner loop using Aspire and OpenAI. And then if I'm traveling and I don't have uh, a lot of good connections, I'll switch to running local images on Docker so that I can keep developing. So there's a ton of amazing capabilities you have, and I highly recommend you spend some time exploring that. So normally I would take questions, but please check out .NET Aspire and all the Aspire samples and the AI samples along with the new extensions.ai. And also go out to Aspirify. You can see, look, we have out at aspirify.net. There are a ton of articles and blog posts and videos there for you to consume. Please feel free to reach out and connect. And thank you for having me on the festive calendar.